ELPC Thinks webinar on Illinois wetlands. My name is David McEllis, and I'm the Illinois Legislative Director for the Environmental Law and Policy Center. In these ELPC Thinks series, we bring together experts, environmental leaders, community partners. In these ELPC Thinks webinars, we bring together experts, environmental leaders, and community partners to forge new strategies for progress. Just a quick heads up, we are recording this webinar and posting it to YouTube, as well as streaming live on Facebook to share. And so for those of you who are not able to join us today, good to see you in the future. Today, we're honored to have with us Paul Botts, Executive Director of the Wetlands Initiative, an organization that designs, restores, and creates wetlands. And we're also joined by John Devine, Director of Freshwater Ecosystems at NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. Earlier this year, NRDC released a report outlining the potential for wetlands impacts following the 2023 Sackett versus EPA Supreme Court decision. And so we're here today to talk about the threats and opportunities for Illinois wetlands and what we can do about it here in the state of Illinois. After the Sackett decision, ELPC, NRDC, the Wetlands Initiative, and many other organizations were joined together to talk about what we could do to assess the situation in Illinois post-Sackett. And John will go into the Sackett decision a little bit later, but in short, that decision gutted the number of wetlands that are protected by the Federal Clean Water Act. Unlike many surrounding states, Illinois in the past never passed a comprehensive state wetlands protection law. We have some county protections in a handful of counties, but in the aftermath of Sackett, those protections remain, but the rest of the state is left with very little protection. So what that means is that if somebody wants to fill in a wetland, in many cases that can be done without replacement, without mitigation, without any concern for what impact that's going to have on the surrounding water and land environment. So we need to do something to protect the remaining wetlands in Illinois and increase that number to protect against the already visible impacts of climate change. We've seen recently 1,000-year rain events throughout the country, 4 in a single week, including one in Illinois. Flooding is already an issue, and this is only going to get worse. And without wetlands to soak up that water, this is just a future disaster waiting to happen, and disasters that are already happening. So in 2024, we introduced legislation and then again reintroduced that in 2025 to create the Wetlands Protection Act in Illinois. And that legislation had significant legislative support, but ended up stalling out due to budget constraints throughout the budget, but specifically at the Department of Natural Resources, which is the agency that in the legislation is tasked with running the permitting program. With veto session coming up in October 2025, we hope to see some action on this topic, and we'll have an action alert that you can click on in the chat throughout the presentation. But then again, we'll send that to you to contact your legislators as well as the governor, and we'll send that around in a follow-up email after the presentation. So let's dive into this topic. First, we'll hear from Paul Botts to learn a little bit more about wetlands and their importance, as well as the work of the Wetlands Initiative. And then we'll hear from John afterwards to talk about the Sackett decision, some recent federal actions, and the NRDC report and its findings in Illinois. For those who are watching, at any time, if you'd like to ask a question, click the Q&A icon on your screen and type in your question. We'll get to as many of those as we can over time. And without further ado, Paul Botts of the Wetlands Initiative, take it away.
All right, thank you, David. It's great to be here. Yeah, the Wetlands Initiative was founded 30 years ago in Chicago, working increasingly across the Midwest. And as David summarized, we were sort of created as a nonprofit to take on the hard cases. So designing and restoring wetlands kind of in the places in our heavily developed Midwest where you might not think it could be possible. And in fact, some cases where we're working right now, conservationists for many years didn't think it was possible or weren't sure. In the course of that, we've learned a lot about not just wetlands. We employ both ecologists and engineers, but also about people's perceptions of wetlands. And that's kind of a good tag into the political arena. which I've been participating in under the great tutelage of David and others who are more expert in it. Wetlands Initiative isn't normally a political or partisan. We're not a partisan organization. We're not normally involved in policy making, but when the Supreme Court majority issued their 5-4 weirdness known as Sackett, we looked at ourselves and said, well, it's the name on the door. We can't sit this one out. So we've been very involved, and it's been very educational learning about how many people perceive wetlands. A couple of misconceptions. I'll mention a couple, and then I'll mention a big one that's extremely salient to the discussion in Springfield and some other state capitals right now. A couple that come up in our business are, you often hear, well, wait a minute, you restoration guys with the wetlands, are you going to make a new mosquito farm right next to my subdivision or my town? And of course, the answer is no. A healthy wetland, a restored wetland, is not a mosquito farm. There's lots of things in there that eat mosquito larvae, and also the water levels are not stagnant. They move up and down. That's good. That's nature. The mosquito farm is that stagnant drainage ditch right next to your house. That's where the mosquitoes are coming from. So that's point one. Another one is you mentioned flooding. That's incredibly salient to this issue politically and culturally. And one thing you often get is it looks to people like when you are protecting or restoring a small wetland next to their neighborhood, that you are bringing the floodwaters to them. It just looks that way. It's sort of intuitive at a basic level. Of course, exactly the opposite is true. As David mentioned, these are sponges. These are literal sponges on the landscape. They work exactly like the sponges in your kitchen. They hold the water until either they dry out naturally, or if you want to squeeze your sponge, you can squeeze it out. But the wetland just dries out naturally, so it is absorbing flood water and able to release it in a way that doesn't create our big problems. And particularly the small scattered wetlands, which the flat Midwest was originally blessed with in great quantity, that gets to local flooding. So it isn't just the 1,000-year or 200-year floods that make the headlines where we benefit from the presence of wetlands. Indeed, at the local level, the scattered small ones are just quietly absorbing water and keeping the nearest 5 basements from flooding, as opposed to 500 with the big event. That's very important. But the biggest misconception by far, and I know everyone that works for the Wetlands Initiative learns this sooner or later, is that there is widespread, millions and millions of Americans, both positive and negative about wetlands, believe or assume or think even that they've been told by people like us that once it becomes wet, it's a wetland. I've gotten that phone call, I don't know, 24 times while I'm working at the Wetlands Initiative. Someone who says, oh, look, the vacant lot down the street, the last storm put a whole bunch of water on it. It's been wet for 3 days. So now it's a wetland. So now it has to be protected, right? No, not right. That is not the definition of a wetland, never has been, neither in science nor in engineering or in law. The definition of a wetland requires time. It is a place that is wet regularly for many, many years. The biota, the plants, the animals, the microorganisms, the insects have evolved and depend upon regular, consistent wetland for many, many years. Even the soil chemistry gets changed. So it is not the case, and never has been, that the fact of having a law in place, federal or state or county, which requires certain things of a landowner when there is a officially delineated wetland present, it's never been the case that last week's big storm or even a whole wet season can suddenly create wetlands, legal wetlands, scientific wetlands on a piece of property that previously didn't have it. And certainly in Springfield, I've learned that many people believe this. Their policymakers believe it. I've read the Sackett ruling, and several justices of the Supreme Court believe it to be true, sadly, but it is not true and never has been. And there's no proposal on the table to have that be the case, just to be clear. I'll just add a little bit about the value of wetlands in addition to the flooding, which is so crucial and so salient and so even more important in our changing climate, as David mentioned. They are, of course, also great filters. Wetlands filter out all kinds of impurities, pollutions of various types and help our waterways and our lakes, our streams, little rivers, big rivers, great big rivers, and everything from the nutrient pollution, which is something my organization is directly working with farmers on with wetlands, but other kinds of pollution and damaging runoff as well. They are great places of beauty. People are drawn to healthy wetlands. Healthy, beautiful wetlands through the seasons are very attractive and are community assets. And of course, related to that, and also related to the climate point, is biodiversity. Wetlands are sinks of biodiversity, incredibly diverse. And it isn't just the many types of organisms that spend their whole life cycles in the wetlands. Many others spend parts of their life cycles in the wetland. And if you have lots of wetlands scattered across your landscape, you have refugia as the climate continues to change, which it's going to do no matter what happens in the next year or 10 years or 50 years with climate. We're only arguing now over how much the climate continues warming, not whether it does. And wetlands are marvelous as a strategy for adaptation and resilience in the situation of a changing climate. The last thing I'll mention by way of background is, again, it's something that many people are surprised by, I've learned. Actually, I did not really realize this till I joined the Wetlands Initiative a bunch of years ago, that the flat American Midwest originally had far more wetlands. This is meaning going back thousands of years since the glaciers, far more wetlands than is really necessarily obvious. Because we all grew up, of course, in a Midwest that is covered in the many farms and cities and everything else. But if you think about it, our region is blessed with these great, vast river systems, the Mississippi system, and then the many great big tributaries of the Great Lakes system. And in nature, these rivers flowing through vast, flat, mostly flat landscapes moved around. They created wetlands over many centuries and millennia. And we have all this wonderful, soft, black soil, which makes it easy for rivers to move around in. And because it's flat, the water doesn't run off the land very fast. If you look at a hydric soils map of the state of Illinois, and I'm not going to explain how hydric soils are wetlands fingerprints, but they are, and you look at it, you discover that the historic wetlands were overwhelmingly in the flat prairie parts of our state. And when you look at the Shawnee Hills or northwestern Illinois, where it's much hillier and gravelly, there was far fewer wetlands. That was simply because the water tended to run off, as it would in a mountains context. So the Midwest states, such as Illinois, part of the reason that we've lost so much of our original wetlands, such high percentages gone, is precisely because we had so much in the first place. And that's not something that you would think. You would think of the Everglades or whatever in terms of wetland, but this region was originally quite blessed in that regard. So that's kind of the background and kind of sets us up for where we got to when Supreme Court took up this issue for not the first time in 2022-3. And so now I'll turn it back to David and John.
Thanks, Paul. That does set us up perfectly. Yes, there was a 20 plus year erosion of the wetlands protection that ultimately led up to the Sackett decision. But now I will pass to John to talk about that decision as well as the NRDC report post Sackett. And John has some slides to share. Thank you very much, John. Take it away.
Great. Can you see my slides, David? Terrific. Thanks. Thank you all for having me today. Again, my name is John Devine. I'm with the Natural Resources Defense Council. And as David and Paul alluded to, I'm going to talk about the Federal Clean Water Act and the Supreme Court Sackett decision, which, in my opinion, represents the worst judicial rollback of federal environmental protections in history. The Clean Water Act was adopted in 1972 by a wide bipartisan majority in Congress after decades of failed management by states and overwhelming pollution problems that led to trashed waterways nationwide and infamously multiple rivers catching on fire. Because Congress recognized that a tough law would be necessary to address these widespread pollution crises, the law's drafters intentionally extended pollution protections to all kinds of waters. Specifically, the law directs that federally protected waters can't be dumped in or destroyed without the discharger going through a permitting process to ensure that the harm is minimized and mitigated. It does not stop development. And I think that's something really important to stress. The law also requires the cleanup of protected waters that don't meet state standards, and it ensures that oil and gas facilities and federally permitted activities like pipelines won't cause undue harm. And thanks to the law and its broad applicability to all kinds of water bodies, the country's waterways improved immensely in the wake of the Clean Water Act. The rate of wetland loss dropped dramatically. That new protection was really important in states like Illinois, where development and agribusiness had already wiped out the vast majority of wetlands that had been there prior to colonization. However, the bold goals of the law were never met, and even many decades after the law's adoption, the majority of water bodies still had pollution problems, and wetlands continued to be lost at an alarming rate. So, against this backdrop of both successes and ongoing challenges under the federal law came the Sacketts, an Idaho couple that ran an excavation company and who were represented by an anti-environmental legal organization. They filled wetlands on their property without a permit, which EPA and 2 federal courts concluded would have had a significant impact on the large recreational lake a stone's throw away. The finding that the wetlands were significant for water quality in that downstream lake was sufficient under a prior Supreme Court precedent to deem the wetlands covered by the Clean Water Act. However, the court's new ultra-conservative majority adopted a new test for what the law covers. It ruled that waters have to be relatively permanent, waters like streams and lakes and ponds have to be relatively permanent to be included, and that wetlands had to meet an additional hurdle of having a, quote, continuous surface connection to other protected waters in order to be protected. The court didn't bother to define either relatively permanent or continuous surface connection, and neither term appears in the Clean Water Act. So what is that going to mean for the country's waterways? Right out of the gate, according to an EPA official at the time, as many as 63% of the wetland acres and millions of miles of streams could be at risk of being unprotected as a result of the court's decision. EPA immediately adopted regulations to incorporate this decision, as it was obliged to. And it excluded streams that flowed only in response to precipitation and many kinds of wetlands. Based on the implementation of those rules, most of the on-the-ground determinations of whether a particular water body was covered by the law, which is done in the field typically by the Army Corps of Engineers, those were finding that the most waters were no longer protected by the federal law. If that weren't bad enough, there's a chance that Sackett's rollback could get much worse. The Trump administration has pledged to change the federal rules that govern what water bodies are protected by the law, and has indicated that it's looking to even further limit the kinds of streams and wetlands that might be protected by those regulations. We expect a proposal literally any day now from the federal agencies. Additionally, numerous regulated industries have argued in court to EPA and to Congress that wetlands can't be protected unless there is water continuously at the surface of the wetland and the wetland meets some completely opaque, I know it when I see it, kind of test of being indistinguishable from nearby waters. Adopting that kind of test would be a disaster. Frankly, most of this is already a disaster. This would be an unmitigated disaster. Anyone who works in the freshwater world can tell you that waterways are physically distinguishable from the wetlands abutting them, even when they're functionally intertwined, which is very often the case. So to assess what Sackett put at risk in more detail and to look at the potential implications of some of these additional interpretive jumps that polluters are urging the federal agencies to make, NRDC did a GIS-based analysis. We looked at a couple of national databases, the National Wetland Inventory and the National Hydrography Dataset, to map the potential extent of protected and non-protected waters under a variety of scenarios. We produced maps that outline which wetlands are likely to be protected or not following Sackett, looking at 3 scenarios, which we called damaging, because any interpretation of Sackett is going to be harmful, more damaging, and most damaging. In my view, the middle and worst case scenarios are today the ones most closely to focus on, because it seems likely that EPA will adopt rules potentially as close to that middle scenario, or if industry lobbyists went out in their push, maybe even close to the worst case scenario. As you can see from these numbers, those would be horrific on the landscape. Same is true in Illinois, where you can see that somewhere between roughly 2/3 and almost all of the individual wetlands would be at risk under those mid and worst case scenarios. In the counties with the greatest share of Illinois' at-risk wetlands, we also used a tool developed by the First Street Foundation to look at the number of properties at risk of flooding. There are already hundreds of thousands of properties at risk of flooding, and that could get much worse if wetlands were bulldozed without mitigation or any kind of protection. And so that's why NRDC has been part of the coalition in Illinois pushing for state legislation that David alluded to prevent unregulated wetland destruction, because those federal safeguards are no longer in place. And that's it for me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with y'all today.
Thanks, John. And I appreciated the map that and the mapping tools that NRDC put together using the GIS data, and encourage folks to go to that. And I will include a link to that map in just a minute, or we'll include that in the follow-up email, because you can overlay the protections pre-Sackett and then under the different scenarios, and it kind of shows some of the absurdity of this ruling, that even no great friend of the environment. Thank you, John, for including that map in the chat. That even no great friend of the environment, Justice Kavanaugh said, would leave long regulated and long accepted to be regulable wetlands suddenly beyond the scope of the agency's regulatory authority. And when you look at this map and see some of those areas, they're almost directly adjacent to flowing bodies of water, but there is some disconnection, and something about them is not continuously flowing, and so therefore they would lose protection under some of these interpretations. And you pointed a little bit to the Illinois situation. How does Illinois compare to other Midwest states as far as the potential for protection losses? It's
on the same basic order of magnitude. The overall percentage of wetland acres might not be very high under our middle scenario, but the number or the number of individual wetlands, the percentages are quite high, and I think that's largely due to, as I said, the fact that Illinois has already lost some 85% of its historic wetlands. And under our worst case scenario, really there's no place in the country that isn't really in trouble.
And there's a couple of questions in the chat. One is about whether the Sackett decision preempted Illinois Collier County and Cook County wetland protections provided through the Stormwater Management Commissions and Water Development Ordinances. Paul, do you want to take that?
No, actually, it does not. It's important to remember that the Sackett ruling is not a constitutional ruling, but a statutory one. So it was all about what a written federal law does and does not cover. And the language in the Clean Water Act and its later 70s revision it has been fuzzy enough on this point to spark, 40 years or something of court cases and serial Supreme Court cases going back all that time arguing over this. The 5-4 majority in Sackett, cut through all that with a bulldozer, so to speak. But it's important to note too that actually the majority in its majority ruling made a reference to, and help me out, David, which justice was the author of the majority ruling?
Justice Alito.
Alito, yes, wrote that indeed one of his points, there were sort of side points, but he meant it, was that actually the states are the quote unquote appropriate place for this discussion and debate about what does and does not get regulated in natural resources generally and wetlands in particular. And so one of the things we have, our little band of advocates in Springfield these last 2 sessions has been saying is, at one level, we're actually following the Supreme Court majority's instructions here. And the county level programs are authorized in turn by a state law in the 80s, which made it possible for counties to do that. That's still the case. Nothing has been changed there. There's 5 or 6 counties in Northeast Illinois that have those permit and mitigation programs in place and have for many years in most of their cases. They're perfectly sound programs. Are they perfect? Of course not, but they work. And any other county in Illinois is free to adopt them. Not that we expect many or any of them to do so, but none of that is changed by the federal ruling, which simply dealt with what is covered by the federal law.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions that are federal related. John, I might direct these at you. One was whether Sackett could be reversed by an amendment to the Clean Water Act.
Yes, 100%. Eventually, we need to do that.
But of course,
I think that was
expects that in our lifetimes, quite frankly. But at least I don't. I think I'm older than these guys, so maybe that helps. But honestly, in the present political climate, foreseeable future, it's really very hard to imagine that even getting to a vote, let alone passing. So we have no choice here but to deal with the states and to the degree we can, the federal judiciary.
Yeah, it's going to be a long slog, if anything, and in the meantime, open season in those states that don't have their own protection. So definitely.
And John, there's also a point in the chat about the Permit Act. Do you want to cover that and how that relates here?
Sure. There is a bill that has passed through committee in the House of Representatives at the federal level that has 12.5 different anti-Clean Water Act provisions, one of which would give EPA and the Corps the ability to declare any kind of water body that they choose not to be a protected water of the United States under the Federal Clean Water Act. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think of what this current administration might do. If they don't like ponds, they don't like streams that don't flow year round, just just enact a regulatory exemption for them, and that means kicking that back to the states and only to those states that have those protections.
And that would, if that passed, John, that would be in law.
That's right.
Not
That would
simply
be
administrative rule. So therefore, basically immune to correct change by any court, federal court, more or less, right?
that's correct.
And
We expect that bill will likely get taken up by the full House when they come back in September.
And we have a couple questions about the Illinois Wetlands Protection Act. And one is about the inclusion or exclusion of streams. And so thank you, Julie, for that question. And so initially, when the bill was introduced in 2024, it was more expansive. It included streams, intermittent streams. And through the process of conversation with DNR and other entities, streams were taken out in the first year. And then when we reintroduced the bill, we knew that there would be more conversations around that. And this has come up whether or not we would re-include streams. And I think part of that is dependent upon what the Department of Natural Resources believes that they can manage. And that there was a question in the chat about what the DNR's budget had to do with wetlands management. And partially, this wasn't necessarily about the specifics of the dollar amount for DNR. It was that all agencies were given a directive that they should not increase headcount or increase budgets going into this past year where there was a significant budget deficit. And so it wasn't necessarily about wetlands. It was just about creating new programs. And so that was how that wetlands protection, just by building a new program and putting that on DNR, would increase their budget and impact their staff levels. And so that kind of goes back to the question about streams, which is how much work is DNR able to do? And they want to be able to do this well, and they want to be able to have a program that they believe they can run and that they can run well. So that is something that we would love to see back in there, and was taken out in an attempt to get support from DNR, but we are definitely open to that should that be something that if the governor wants a comprehensive wetlands protection bill, we believe that would include streams as well. And then the other question was about attempts to engage stakeholders like farmers and developers. We have had multiple meetings with every opponent that you can imagine to the bill and every supporter of the bill. I think that there are farmers who have stood with us and supported the bill, including at its introduction. There are individual farmers. There are also farm entities that oppose the bill, despite the fact that the bill maintains an exemption for farming activities that existed at the federal level. So yes, we are open to those conversations, and would like to continue to have those should the bill move forward in the fall. Thank you, Chelsea.
Let me just add, and I can speak, not being a policy professional as David and John are, I can maybe speak a little more bluntly about both of those. On the streams point, that is an example of a consequence of the fact that while we have very enthusiastic and persistent sponsors and co-sponsors for the bill in Springfield, we have not yet been able to get the governor, either directly or through his office, really sort of off the fence regarding this bill. And David and many others have put in a lot of yeoman's work on that point, and it's not like we're getting no or anything, but it's a matter of getting to the top of the governor's agenda and getting them to come off that fence. And I would say that my sort of naive rookie view of the politics in Springfield is that if the governor, who is after all the governor in charge with a smashing majority in both chambers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, won re-election handily, I think is expected to do so again, right? He's got a lot of political capital and oomph in Springfield. if we were going to sort of go bigger with the bill and hope to succeed, really that cannot happen without the governor's leadership. That's the reality. And part of that reason for that is that some of the folks who oppose this concept, or to put another way, who applauded the Sackett ruling, are folks who are, first of all, there's a comprehensive lack of trust, loss of trust. There's no trust whatsoever. I mean, I've read all these cliches for 10 years in the press, and not until sitting with David and testifying in front of a couple of General Assembly committees in Springfield recently did I really experience it for the first time and see it. The loss of trust across the partisan divide is just so striking. And furthermore, there's so many people, including so many farmers and the farm trade groups, that are just so dug in on that one misconception that I mentioned. They really do believe. They simply looked me in the eye and said, I don't believe you, when I explained to them that it is not the case that last week's rainstorm can turn their drainage ditch on their farm into a wetland that the wetland police are going to show up and tell them they can no longer do anything with. They just flatly don't believe me, because for 40 years they've heard and read the opposite. And in particular, ironically, I've realized that they have heard the opposite from people who support us. So many well-meaning people who call my office now and then are certain that this is the way it should be, that last month's rainstorm created a wetland, and they go tell their relatives and they are certain of it and so forth. And this spreads, and there's a general cultural belief that this is the case. And that belief is so deeply embedded in the agricultural community. So we didn't get instantly to that urban legend being widely believed, and will not get instantly to that urban legend being successfully debunked. We're a little bit of a pickle on that one in particular politically.
There's a question about discussions between neighboring states. And at least in Illinois, I haven't noticed this around the wetlands issue. And particularly when we have Indiana rolling back wetlands protections, that is absolutely going to impact the state of water in Illinois and the quality of water in Illinois. So it is something that I wish would happen, because as the question rightly points out, our wetlands don't recognize political boundaries. But I have not seen that recently.
No, far from it. And David, and Indiana is a great example. Of course, the Kankakee River system flows into Illinois and everything else, the Wabash. But also, David, you and I did a panel at the University of Iowa Law School, which was on this topic a year ago. We were covering much of the same ground. And the folks who invited us to do that were very clear that they were doing that because the Iowa State Legislature had pointedly just set this whole thing aside and just said, no, we're not touching any of that. Sackett, that's the law now, period. And the Iowa folks were looking at us going, well, we're hoping to learn some things about how it can be different. And we had to look back at them and go, oh boy. And now there are some positive stories. Wisconsin, actually pre-Sackett, but there's no movement to undo this after Sackett. So Wisconsin had some more positive movement in their laws in recent years. Minnesota and Michigan both have in place state wetland programs. Michigan actually was one that took over delegation from the feds. Again, none of these programs are perfect, not saying they are, but they exist, and it's a very different conversation than you're seeing in Illinois, let alone Indiana, Iowa, and a couple other Midwestern states where there's really no movement in a positive direction at all.
Excellent. Well, so thank you so much. I think we're right about, we are right about a time. I do see, have we considered putting into law a provision stating that heavy rains cannot convert non-wetland land into wetlands? And I think that the way that we have it currently includes a delineation, and a wetland delineator would have to determine that something has the scientific characteristics to be a wetland, as Paul briefly described earlier. But that is if that could fix it, it might be something that we consider.
And we had that language that David just described in from the first draft of the bill, and we've more than once had to defend this point to hostile questioning from state legislators, and we point to that language, and they just look back at us and say, "Yeah, that doesn't mean what you say it means." So that's how deeply embedded this particular misconception is.
And so, just to wrap up here, thank you again. Thank you to John. Thank you to Paul for your time today and for your presentations. We appreciate everybody who joined as well. We also appreciate the work that NRDC and the Wetlands Initiative does to protect wetlands and protect our environment. This right now is a critical time to act on this issue in Illinois, particularly because what we have here is a veto session coming up, and it's time for the legislature and governor to act. So please keep an eye on this issue. Use those links that Mary just dropped into the chat to contact your legislative leaders as well as the governor to ask for the Wetlands Protection Act to get passed in the veto session and for there to be action on this. And we'll be emailing out a recording of this to all of those who registered and sharing it on social media. So thank you again for joining, and please keep an eye out for future ELPC Thinks invitations, and have a great afternoon.